What if I told you that almost every image you have in your head of the most famous man in history is technically incorrect? From the way he looked to the day he was born, and even the job he did for a living, our modern perception of Jesus of Nazareth is often more a product of European Renaissance art and Victorian traditions than the actual Greek and Hebrew texts of the Bible. Most Christians today carry around a mental version of Jesus that would be completely unrecognizable to the people who actually walked the dusty roads of Galilee with him. Today we are stripping away the layers of tradition, cultural bias, and historical myths to reveal the totally wrong facts about Jesus that most believers still take as gospel truth. Get ready to have your Sunday school lessons challenged, because we are diving deep into the real history of the Son of Man. Let's start with the most obvious one: his physical appearance. If you walk into almost any church in the West, you will see a depiction of a man with long, flowing, light brown hair, piercing blue eyes, and skin as pale as a Scandinavian winter. This image is so burned into our collective consciousness that it feels almost disrespectful to question it. However, if we look at the historical and biblical evidence, this version of Jesus is essentially a fantasy. Jesus was a first-century Middle Eastern Jew. He lived in a region where the sun is unforgiving and the people have olive to deep brown skin, dark eyes, and coarse black hair. The famous Shroud of Turin or the paintings by Da Vinci are beautiful, but they reflect the people who painted them, not the man they were painting. Even the Bible itself gives us a hint. In the book of Isaiah, the prophecy says that he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. This suggests he was a very ordinary-looking man for his time. He blended into a crowd so well that Judas had to specifically point him out with a kiss, so the authorities would know which one he was. If he had been a 6-foot-tall man with glowing European features standing among a group of shorter, darker Galileans, no one would have needed a map to find him. While we are on his appearance, let's talk about that long hair. In almost every film and painting, Jesus has hair down to his shoulders. But in the first century, Jewish men typically wore their hair short. In fact, the Apostle Paul, who lived at the same time and traveled in the same circles as the disciples, wrote in the book of 1 Corinthians that it is a disgrace for a man to have long hair. It is highly unlikely that Paul would have written such a thing if the very master he served had been famous for his long locks. The long-haired Jesus look actually mirrors the style of Greek philosophers or later Byzantine royalty, which was adopted by artists centuries later to give Jesus an air of wisdom and authority. In reality, he likely had the short, cropped hair common among the working-class men of Judea. Now let's talk about his career. We've all been told that Jesus was a carpenter. We imagine him in a small wood shop, making chairs, tables, and maybe the occasional wooden plow. But the Greek word used in the Gospels is tekton. While this can mean carpenter, in the context of first-century Israel, it actually refers to a general builder or craftsman. Wood was relatively scarce in the rocky hills surrounding Nazareth, but stone was everywhere. Most houses and structures were built primarily of stone. A tekton in that region was far more likely to be a stonemason than a guy working with wood. This gives a whole new layer of meaning to his parables about building a house on the rock, or his references to being the chief cornerstone that the builders rejected. He wasn't just using metaphors, he was talking about his daily trade. He likely spent his young adult years hauling heavy stones and chipping away at rock, which means he wouldn't have been a fragile, slender figure, but a man of immense physical strength and literal rock-hard hands. What about his name? We call him Jesus, but that's actually a translation of a translation. His original Hebrew name was Yeshua. To his mother Mary and his disciples, he was Yeshua. When the New Testament was written in Greek, Yeshua became Iesus. Later, when the Bible was translated into Latin, it became Iesus, and eventually, in English, we got Jesus. If you were to travel back in time to Nazareth and yell Jesus in the middle of the street, nobody would turn around. They would be looking for a Yeshua. Interestingly, Yeshua was a very common name at the time, equivalent to something like Joshua today. It wasn't a unique, mystical name in his era. It was a name that connected him to the great leaders of Israel's past, specifically Joshua, who led the people into the Promised Land. Then there is the big one, the date of his birth. We celebrate Christmas on December 25th, but there is absolutely zero evidence in the Bible that this was his birthday. In fact, the clues we do have point in a completely different direction. Luke's Gospel tells us that at the time of his birth, shepherds were out in the fields at night watching over their flocks. In the region of Bethlehem, December is the height of winter. It's cold, rainy, and occasionally snowy. Shepherds did not keep their sheep out in the open fields at night during the winter. They brought them into shelters or caves. Most historians and biblical scholars suggest he was more likely born in the spring or the autumn, perhaps during one of the great Jewish festivals like the Feast of Tabernacles. So why December 25th? Around the 4th century, the Roman Church chose this date to coincide with existing winter solstice festivals like the birthday of the unconquered sun. It was a strategic move to help move the culture toward Christianity by baptizing an existing holiday. Speaking of his birth, let's address the three wise men again because it's a fact people just can't seem to get right. No, there weren't necessarily three of them, and no, they were not at the manger. The Gospel of Matthew says they arrived at a house and saw a child, not a baby in a stable. By the time the Magi showed up, Jesus was likely between 1 and 2 years old. This is why Herod ordered the removal of all male children under the age of 2. The image of the three kings standing next to the shepherds and the cows is a beautiful artistic invention that condenses a 2-year timeline into a single night for the sake of a nativity scene. Now, let's move into his personality and his lonely ministry. We often picture Jesus as a solitary figure, wandering the wilderness alone or with just his 12 best friends. But the reality is that Jesus was rarely alone. He was a popular rabbi who traveled with a massive entourage. This group included not just the 12 apostles, but also a large group of women who, according to Luke chapter 8, were actually the ones financing the entire ministry. These women, like Joanna and Susanna, were often of high social standing, and their financial support allowed Jesus and the disciples to travel and preach without having to stop and work for wages. Jesus wasn't a penniless wanderer in the way we often imagine. He headed a well-organized and well-funded traveling organization. Another huge misconception is that Jesus was a Christian. This might sound shocking, but it's a historical fact. Jesus was a devout Jew. He didn't come to start a new religion called Christianity. He came as the Jewish Messiah to fulfill the Jewish scriptures. He wore tzitzit, the ritual fringes on his garment. He observed the Sabbath. He went to the temple for the feasts. He spoke in synagogues. The term Christian didn't even exist until years after his departure, first being used in the city of Antioch. Jesus lived, breathed, died, and rose as a son of Israel. When we pull him out of his Jewish context and try to make him a modern Western Christian, we lose the heart of what he was actually saying to his audience. While we are talking about his teachings, let's address the gentle Jesus, meek and mild trope. We often imagine him as a soft-spoken, almost ethereal figure who floated through the air and never raised his voice. But the Jesus of the Gospels was actually quite a firebrand. He was a man who walked into the temple, the most sacred space in the world, and started flipping over heavy stone tables and driving people out with a whip. He made himself. He called the religious leaders of his day whitewashed tombs and vipers. He was a radical who challenged the status quo so fiercely that the most powerful empire on earth felt the need to execute him. He wasn't just nice, he was revolutionary, and his words were meant to cut to the heart, not just give you a warm, fuzzy feeling. Let's talk about the stable. We've all seen the pictures of a wooden barn or a lean-to behind an inn, but in 1st century Bethlehem, animals weren't usually kept in wooden barns. They were kept in caves or on the lower level of the house. The manger was likely a stone feeding trough carved into the floor of a cave or a home. So, the birth of Jesus was likely a much darker, cooler and stonier affair than the wooden barn aesthetic suggests. It also would have been incredibly crowded. Since everyone was returning to their ancestral homes for the census, the inn or guest room was full of relatives. Jesus was likely born in the middle of a bustling, noisy family home, surrounded by cousins and livestock, rather than in a quiet, isolated stable on the edge of town. Did Jesus have siblings? Most people are taught that he was an only child, especially in traditions that emphasize the perpetual state of his mother. However, the Gospels of Matthew and Mark explicitly name his brothers: James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. It even mentions that he had sisters. While some traditions argue these were cousins or spiritual brothers, the Greek word used is adelphos, which almost always means a biological brother. James, the brother of Jesus, went on to become the leader of the church in Jerusalem. Growing up in a house full of younger brothers and sisters would have deeply shaped Jesus' understanding of family, responsibility, and the messy reality of human relationships. Here is another one. Jesus was poor. We often hear that he was a peasant who had nothing. While it's true he didn't have a permanent home during his 3-year ministry, His family was likely what we would consider middle class for the time. Being a skilled craftsman or builder meant you had a stable income. When he was born, the wise men brought him gold, frankincense, and myrrh, gifts with enormous financial value. During his ministry, his inner circle had a treasurer, Judas, which implies there was a significant amount of money to manage. When he was executed, the Roman soldiers gambled for his tunic because it was a seamless, high-quality garment that was too valuable to tear. He wasn't a man of extreme luxury, but he also wasn't the destitute beggar he's often portrayed to be. What about the miracles? We often think of the miracles as Jesus breaking the rules of nature just to show off his power. But if you look at the types of miracles he did, they were very specific. He healed the sick, fed the hungry, and calmed the storm. In Jewish thought, these weren't just magic tricks. They were signs of the age to come. He was showing people what the world looks like when God is in charge. He wasn't breaking the rules of nature. He was restoring nature to its original, uncorrupted state. The miracles were a preview of a world without suffering, which is a much more powerful message than just, "Look what I can do." Let's discuss the temptation in the wilderness. We see the paintings of Jesus talking to a red-shored man with goat legs, but the Bible says the adversary came to him. It doesn't describe a physical appearance. It was a battle of the mind and the spirit, a clash of two different kingdoms. The wrong fact here is the cartoonish way we've personified the struggle. For Jesus, the temptation was to use his power for himself, to make bread, to rule the world, to test God. It was a struggle of identity, not a spooky meeting with a monster. How about the Last Supper? We mentioned Leonardo da Vinci's painting before, but let's look at the actual meal. It likely wasn't just a quick snack before the end. If it was a Passover Seder, it was a multi-hour, highly ritualized meal full of singing, storytelling, and specific cups of wine. They weren't sitting in chairs at a table. They were reclining on the floor, leaning on their left elbows and eating with their right hands. This means Jesus was literally leaning back toward his friends while he spoke. It was an intimate, heavy, and deeply symbolic evening that had been practiced by Jewish families for over 1,000 years. The trial of Jesus is another area filled with misconceptions. Many people believe the Jewish people as a whole were responsible for his end. This has led to horrific consequences throughout history. But the Bible shows that the crowd in Jerusalem was likely a small, staged group of supporters of the high priest, not the entire Jewish nation. In fact, the general population loved Jesus, which is exactly why the religious leaders had to arrest him secretly at night. They were afraid of a riot. The execution was a Roman act, carried out by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate for the Roman crime of sedition. The wrong fact that the Jewish people killed Jesus is not only biblically inaccurate, but has been a tool for prejudice for centuries. Speaking of the execution, let's talk about the cross. We see the classic T shape everywhere, but Roman crosses came in many forms. Sometimes they were an X, sometimes they were a simple upright pole, and sometimes they were a T with the crossbar on top of the vertical stake. Most historians believe Jesus likely carried only the horizontal crossbar, called the patibulum, through the streets, which would then be hoisted onto a permanent vertical post. And the idea that the nails went through his palms is also historically unlikely. The palms can't support the weight of a human body. The nails were almost certainly driven through the wrists, which in the ancient world were considered part of the hand. Did Jesus really claim to be God? Some people argue that he never actually said the words, "I am God." However, to a first-century Jewish audience, his claims were even more radical. When he said, "Before Abraham was, I am," he was using the personal, divine name of God revealed to Moses at the burning bush. When he claimed the authority to forgive sins, something only God was believed to do, the religious leaders immediately tried to stone him for blasphemy. He didn't need to use a modern theological formula. He used the language and actions of his culture to make his identity crystal clear. Let's talk about the harrowing of hell. There's a popular idea that between his burial and resurrection, Jesus went down into a literal underworld to fight demons and rescue people. While the Bible mentions him preaching to the spirits in prison, the cinematic, action movie version of this event is largely based on medieval tradition and apocryphal books like the Gospel of Nicodemus. The focus of the New Testament is less on the where he went, and more on the victory he achieved over the powers of darkness. The resurrection itself is often misunderstood. Many think of it as a ghost story or a spiritual vision, but the Gospels are incredibly insistent on the physical nature of it. Jesus ate fish. He told Thomas to touch his wounds. He wasn't a floating spirit. He was a flesh and blood human being in a new, transformed state. This is a crucial distinction in Christian theology. It's not about escaping the body, but about the redemption of the body. The wrong fact is the idea that he became a ghost, when the text says he became the first of a new humanity. How about the ascension? We often picture Jesus floating up into the clouds like a rocket ship until he disappears into outer space. But in ancient thought, the heavens wasn't just up. It was a different dimension that overlapped with our own. The cloud was a symbol of the divine presence, like the one that led the Israelites in the desert. The ascension wasn't a journey to another planet. It was his entrance into the throne room of the universe, a move into the control center of reality. Let's talk about his language. Many people think Jesus spoke the King James English they read in their Bibles. Others think he spoke Hebrew. In reality, the common language of the region was Aramaic. He almost certainly spoke Aramaic at home and during his teachings. He likely knew enough Hebrew to read the scriptures in the synagogue, and he possibly knew enough Greek to speak with Roman officials or travelers in Galilee. The Greek we read in the New Testament is a translation of his original Aramaic words. This means that every time we read a red-letter verse, we are already one step away from the original sound of his voice. One of the most persistent myths is that Jesus was a socialist or a capitalist. We love to project our modern political systems onto him, but Jesus lived in a Roman-occupied agrarian society. He wasn't interested in the tax codes of a modern nation-state. He was interested in the kingdom of God. His teachings on wealth, power, and justice transcend our modern political binaries. When we try to fit him into a political party, we usually end up making a Jesus in our own image, rather than following the one in the text. What about the Holy Grail? Again, the idea that there is a magical cup out there that Jesus used at the Last Supper has zero biblical basis. The cup was a tool for the meal, not a mystical artifact. The focus of the story is on his blood representing a new covenant, not on the ceramic or metal vessel that held the wine. The hunt for the Grail is a medieval legend that has more to do with the Crusades and French poetry than with the Gospel accounts. Did Jesus ever laugh? If you look at most religious art, he looks solemn, serious, and perhaps even a bit sad. But the Bible says he was a man who went to so many parties and banquets that his enemies accused him of being a glutton and a drunkard. You don't get invited to that many parties if you are a buzzkill. He told jokes that his audience would have found hilarious, like the idea of someone trying to pick a tiny speck out of a friend's eye while having a massive wooden beam stuck in their own. His parables were full of wit, irony, and social satire. He was a man full of joy, even in the midst of his mission. Let's look at the sinless life. While the core of the faith is that he never sinned, people often interpret sinless as boring or unhuman. But Jesus experienced every human emotion. He got tired, he got hungry, he got angry, he wept at the tomb of a friend. He experienced agony and dread in the Garden of Gethsemane. Being without sin didn't mean he wasn't fully human. It meant he was the most human person who ever lived because he was the only one whose humanity wasn't twisted by selfish motivations. Another wrong fact is that Jesus was a loner. We've touched on his large entourage, but he also had a very close-knit group of friends. He had a special relationship with Peter, James, and John. He was deeply close to Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. This shows that the central figure of the faith wasn't a detached, cold deity, but someone who valued and needed human friendship. He spent his final night on earth asking his friends to stay awake with him because he didn't want to be alone in his distress. Let's address the cleansing of the temple. We often think this happened once, at the end of his ministry. But the Gospel of John places it at the very beginning. Some scholars believe he actually did it twice, once to start his ministry and once to conclude it. This shows that his opposition to the corruption of the religious system wasn't a sudden outburst. It was a consistent theme of his life. He was always at odds with those who used the name of God to exploit the poor. And how about the tomb of Jesus? We often see a small, round stone that looks like a coin. But the stone rolled in front of a wealthy man's tomb would have been a massive disc, several feet in diameter and nearly a foot thick, sitting in a sloped trench. It would have taken several strong men to move it. This makes the rolled-away stone in the Easter story even more significant. It wasn't just a heavy door. It was a displaced obstacle that demonstrated a power beyond human strength. Then there is the missing years of Jesus. People love to speculate that he went to India or Britain or Egypt during his teens and 20s. There is no historical or biblical evidence for any of this. The most likely fact is also the most mundane. He stayed in Nazareth and worked in the family business. In that culture, the oldest son took over the father's trade. He lived an ordinary life until the time was right. There is something powerful in the idea that for 30 years, the most important person in history was just an ordinary guy doing his job and taking care of his family. What about his education? Many people think he was an unlettered peasant, but as a Jewish boy in Galilee, he would have attended Beth Sefer at the local synagogue, where he would have memorized large portions of the Torah. He was clearly a master of Hebrew rhetoric and debate. He was so well educated in the scriptures that at the age of 12, he was having deep theological discussions with the experts in Jerusalem. He wasn't a scholar in the official sense, but he was brilliant, and his mastery of the text was what allowed him to deconstruct the arguments of the Pharisees and Sadducees so easily. Another common misconception is that Jesus came to bring world peace. While he is the Prince of Peace, he also said, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword." He wasn't talking about literal violence, but about the division his message would cause. Living according to his teachings often puts people at odds with their own families, their cultures, and their governments. True peace, in his view, often requires a struggle against injustice and a willingness to be different from the world. Let's talk about the crown of thorns. We see a neat little circlet in paintings, but the thorns of that region are long, sharp, and can be over an inch long. The crown wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a brutal instrument of pain. Furthermore, it was likely woven into a cap shape that covered the entire head rather than just a rim. It was a mockery of a royal crown, meant to humiliate as much as to harm. Finally, the idea that Jesus is just a good moral teacher. This is a popular view in the modern world, but as C.S. Lewis famously argued, a man who said the things Jesus said, claiming to be the source of life, to have existed before the world began, and to have the power to judge all of humanity, cannot be just a good moral teacher. He's either someone who is deeply deluded, someone who is intentionally deceptive, or he is exactly who he said he was. The options for a safe, nice Jesus who doesn't challenge your entire worldview aren't actually in the Bible. The Jesus of history and the Jesus of the Bible is far more complex, rugged, and surprising than the one we see in Hallmark cards or European art. When we sweep away the totally wrong facts, we find a man who was deeply rooted in his culture, fiercely committed to his mission, and much more real than the polished icons suggest. He wasn't a distant figure in a stained glass window. He was a man of stone, dust, sweat, and profound love. Understanding the real Jesus means letting go of our own biases and traditions to see him for who he actually was. When we do that, his words take on a new weight, his actions have more meaning, and the story of his life becomes even more incredible. Don't be afraid to question the facts you've always been told. The truth is usually much more interesting than the myth. Thank you for sticking with us as we explored these deep-seated misconceptions. It's a journey of discovery that never really ends. The more we learn about the context of the first century, the more the pages of the scripture come to life in high definition. We hope this has challenged you and encouraged you to look again at the man at the center of the story. Stay curious, keep reading, and we will see you in the next one.